Argentina, 2017. A 12-year-old girl named Florencia Di Marco lives an ordinary life in the small town of San Luis. School, friends, notebooks in which she sometimes leaves disturbing notes. From the outside, everything looks familiar. But inside the family, things happen that no one wants to talk about out loud. The teachers notice that something is wrong with the child. They raise the alarm, but the alarm remains alarm. It doesn't go any further. The neighbors guess but prefer not to interfere. And the mother is always nearby, the one who should be the first defense. But instead of protection, silence. In a few weeks, the whole country will repeat her name, Florencia, the story of how a child found herself alone with her fears. And the adult system, school, services, even relatives, did nothing. Her stepfather is the main suspect. He will never live to see the trial. He will die in a cell. Her mother will end up in the dock, accused not of action, but of inaction. And society will ask itself for the first time, how could this happen if there were warnings? This is not just a chronicle of a crime. It is an indictment of silence and the beginning of a conversation that continues to this day under the cry, ni una menos, not one girl less. San Luis is a provincial town in the heart of Argentina. Life here flows more slowly than in noisy Buenos Aires. During the day, warm streets, shaded trees, school children walking home. In the evening, the familiar silence of a small town where everyone knows everyone. In this silence lived Florencia Di Marco, a girl who was only 12. She studied like thousands of other schoolgirls. She loved to draw. Sometimes she made notes in her notebook, a very ordinary one, with a colored cover. But in these notes, they would later find words that did not correspond to the child's age. The words are heavy, alien to a child's hand. From the outside, everything looked familiar. Florence had a mother, Karina. A stepfather lived nearby, a man who, by all standards, should have taken on the role of protector of the family. But what happened behind the closed doors of their house was hidden even from the closest neighbors. School was the first place where adults began to notice the changes. The teachers said the girl became withdrawn, as if scared. Sometimes her eyes betrayed a tiredness that should not be in a child. At some point, that very word appeared. Dictionary, found in her backpack. A small notebook in which, next to the usual school notes, there were gloomy, disturbing notes. For the teachers, this was a signal. The teachers reported the alarming signs to her mother, but Karina did not pay attention to them. This was the tragic peculiarity of her situation, to be nearby and do nothing. The context of those years was special. Argentina was already living in an atmosphere of growing protests. Every year, the #1 Ni Una Menos movement, not one less, was becoming louder. It began as a cry against femicide, against violence against women and girls. Thousands gathered in the squares. Newspapers wrote about systemic failures. But even though the country was already discussing the problem, in the specific house, in the specific family where Florencia lived, the tragedy was unfolding in silence. And soon this silence would become too loud. March 2017, San Luis. One day when the streets of the province were living their usual life, something happened that changed the course of this story forever. Florencia disappeared. For the neighbors, it was unexpected. For the school, it was alarming, but not entirely surprising. The child had been giving signals for a long time. For the mother, it was like another episode to which she did not know how to react. After a few hours of searching, it became clear. The situation was much more serious. The police got involved quickly. In provincial cities, children disappearing is a rarity, and the entire structure immediately gets back on its feet. Volunteers, neighbors, teachers, everyone was looking for the girl. When she was found, the city froze. Florencia did not return home. She died. The news spread instantly. Radio, newspapers, television. The whole country learned the girl's name that same day. The investigation began immediately. Suspicion fell on the stepfather, Lucas Gomez. He was arrested. The evidence pointed to him. For the police, everything looked almost unambiguous. There was an adult next to the girl who was supposed to be a protector, but turned out to be a threat. But history took a different path. In prison, before the trial, Gomez committed suicide, and with him went the opportunity to hear his confession or denial, to hold an open trial, to ask questions. For society, this became a symbol. The evil that struck escaped justice. And then attention switched to another person, the mother. Investigators began to analyze what she knew and when exactly. Teachers testified. They repeatedly told Karina about alarming signs. Colleagues and neighbors claimed it could have been noticed, but nothing was done. At this stage, the investigation first formulated the idea that would later become central. Silence can also be a crime. After the death of Lucas Gomez, it seemed that the investigation had lost its main suspect. But the investigation did not stop. It turned in the other direction, toward the woman who was supposed to be Florence's main defender, Florencia Di Marco, the girl's mother. The prosecutors formulated the charge not in actions, but in inaction. Their version was harsh. She knew that terrible things were happening near her child. Teachers were signaling. Neighbors suspected. Medical reports hinted at the girl's serious condition, but the mother did nothing to break this cycle. The trial began in 2018 and immediately caused a huge public outcry. For Argentina, this was a precedent. Usually the punishment fell on the direct culprit, but here the system demonstrated for the first time that a parent who turns a blind eye to the obvious bears criminal liability. The courtroom was crowded with journalists. Activists of the No Menos movement were on duty in the corridors. Posters, photos of the girl, slogans against indifference. The judges listened to dozens of witnesses. The teachers described in detail how they tried to attract the mother's attention. Classmates recalled that Florencia often looked depressed. Psychologists analyzed her diaries and a dictionary with strange words and pictures found in her backpack. All these details fit together to form a picture. There were adults next to the child, but no one stood up for her. Karina's defense tried to build a different line. The lawyers said the woman was in a difficult situation, depended on her partner, could not cope alone. But this was not enough for the court. The sentence included words that were later quoted by newspapers. She had a chance to stop the tragedy. She chose silence. Florencia Di Marco received 18 years in prison. The court's decision was a shock. For some, it was justice. For others, it was a controversial step because the mother herself was considered a victim of pressure and fear. But in any case, the sentence sounded like a warning to everyone. Indifference to child protection issues is a crime. When the verdict was announced, there was a noise in the courtroom. Some cried, others applauded, but the main echo was heard far beyond the building. The story of Florencia Di Marco became a symbol, not only of the tragedy of one family, but also of the systemic crisis in which thousands of children all over Argentina found themselves. For the first time, the whole country began to talk about the fact that violence and femicide are not only the story of adult women. They begin much earlier. A girl at the age of 12 found herself in a situation where no one helped her, and society perceived this as its own shame. The No Menos movement took place on the streets of Buenos Aires and San Luis. People came out with photographs of Florence, with the inscriptions, Nunca más, never again. Activists emphasized, silence is complicity, and if the state and loved ones do not intervene, tragedy becomes inevitable. The media devoted dozens of reports to this case. Newspapers wrote not only about the process, but also about what needed to change, strengthening the work of school psychologists, giving teachers real tools to respond, and not just the obligation to report. The question was raised, where exactly did the chain of protection break? For many, the story became personal. Mothers wondered, will I be able to notice if my child is unwell? Will I be able to stand up to any pressure for the sake of his safety? Lectures and discussions were held in schools and universities. Psychologists explained how to read the signs that children give. Lawyers spoke about the importance of legal mechanisms that should force the system to act quickly. But perhaps the most powerful effect was emotional. Florence's name became a reminder. Tragedy can unfold not somewhere on the outskirts of society, but in the most ordinary family where everything seems normal on the surface. The case went down in the Chronicles as a turning point. It changed the perception of the concept of parental responsibility and became the starting point for new discussions on the prevention of violence against children and adolescents. The phrase "ni una menos" in the context of this story acquired a new meaning. It was no longer just a slogan against the murders of women, but also a call to protect the most defenseless: girls, teenagers, those who cannot speak for themselves. The story of Florencia Di Marco is not only a crime story, it is a mirror that reflects several layers of reality at once. In the foreground is the personal tragedy of a 12-year-old girl. She found herself in a situation where the adults called upon to protect her were either indifferent or powerless. In the background is the mother's responsibility. Florencia Di Marco not only ignored the warning signs, but also deprived her daughter of her last chance for salvation. The court found her guilty, and this became a precedent. A parent is responsible not only for actions, but also for inaction. Then there is the failure of the system. The teachers sounded the alarm, but the state mechanisms did not work. Formally, everything was done correctly. Messages were sent, authorities were warned, but in reality, none of these structures stopped the tragedy. And this chain of inaction turned out to be fatal. And finally, the public outcry. Thousands of people took to the streets with posters, with the girl's name on their lips, reminding the authorities that such stories are not isolated cases, but a national problem. Florencia became a symbol of how violence can hide behind the walls of an ordinary home, that ignoring signals can cost lives, and that the phrase "ni una menos" is not just words, but also a commitment by society to protect the most vulnerable. Today, her name is heard in lectures, marches, and publications. It reminds us that the protection system must be alive, not formal. Parents are obliged to listen to their children, and society must react before the tragedy becomes irreversible. This is not a story about the past. It is a warning about the future. This was case number 99, a story where a personal tragedy turned into a public symbol, and silence turned out to be a death sentence. Each such case reminds us that indifference kills, and the memory of these stories is our only chance to change the future.